about 5 in the waiting room right now, but I'm sure more people will come. Hi, welcome to those just joining us. Thank you so much. We're going to begin shortly as we just wait for some more people to come in from the waiting room, and we'll begin in a couple minutes. Thanks so much. Okay, well, while we're waiting, I'll just give my little speech before we get going. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us today for our virtual talk. If I could just remind everyone to keep themselves muted throughout the presentation. Unless Karen opens up a dialogue, then feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen as well, and our speaker will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the program as well. Please note this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. And if you'd like to rewatch this talk or watch previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Karen, to you. Her talk is entitled 17th Century Dutch Painting in Haarlem. So thank you so much, Karen, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Blythe. I'm going to begin with a beautiful image that is in our Timken collection. And this is a work by Jacob van Ruisdael. It's a view of Haarlem and the bleaching fields. These are linen fields that were very big. The production of linen in Haarlem in the 17th century was a very important industry. I will be talking about this painting separately, but I'm going to use it as an image to sort of lay the groundwork for what this talk will be about. What you're looking at is the city of Haarlem. And you know, I did visit Haarlem a few years ago, and it's so reminiscent. It's a kind of a medieval town, and it has these beautiful churches. St. Bavo's here in the mid horizon line. Actually, this is where the artist was buried. And these are the linen being bleached here in the fields, and some houses and workers. So it really captures the essence of what Haarlem was like. Why did I select the city of Haarlem? Well, many of you may know that Haarlem it is about 30 to 45 minutes by car from Amsterdam, but it is a very unique place. And particularly in the early part of the 17th century, Haarlem was an amazing center for the development of painting. Who was living in Haarlem? Well, many of the artists that we have in our Timken collection, Van Ruisdael, Frans Hals, Pieter Claesz, were Haarlem artists. Now, where did they come from? Many, for example, came from Haarlem, but others left in the latter part of the 16th century and the early part of the 17th century. For example, our own Frans Hals, who became the most important portrait painter, one of the most important portrait painters in all of Holland at that time, but came from Haarlem. He was actually Belgian by birth, came from Antwerp, and then went into Haarlem. We're going to talk a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about what the atmosphere was like in Holland at this time. Well, some people use the term golden age for the 17th century Holland. We don't like to use that term because there's some pejorative aspects of that in terms of trading had slavery was part of some of the industry. So we don't really like to use the term golden age. It's just a little antiquated, but it was an age of great success in Holland. Overall, Holland is at this time in the early part of the 17th century really a Protestant nation. At one point in time, the Netherlandish region, which would be today in the North Holland, in the south, Belgium with the little tips of France, would be considered was one nation. But by the end of, let's say by 1607, it was really a separate nation. And then officially about 1666, it was completely separate. Holland maintained as a Protestant nation, Belgium still Spanish and under the Spanish realm and Catholic. The Protestants began to think about separating from the Habsburgs and the Catholic Church as early as the mid part of the 16th century. Remember, 1517 was the beginning of Protestantism with Martin Luther's the 95 edicts on the church wall. He had been influenced by Erasmus, who was a Dutch philosopher who believed that there were things in the Catholic Church that needed to be changed. So the Dutch in the North really grasped this idea of a Protestant religion and Protestant ethos. They were tired of the Habsburg control. They were not interested in maintaining their Catholic religion. And so what is established is the Dutch Reformed Church and also the Calvinists. And in Belgium, it remained under the Habsburg rule for quite a while. What happened during this time in the early part of the 17th century and the latter part of the 16th century, many Flemish artists who were highly skilled, artisans, merchants, painters, came to Haarlem. And that's why it was so successful and prominent. And unfortunately, however, about 1625, Haarlem was less the center of art, and it moves really to Amsterdam, which is, as I said, 30 to 45 minutes away. Amsterdam became a great center for art and learning and economics. And of course, artists like Rembrandt van Rijn set up their studios. But now we're going to talk kind of specifically about Haarlem. Haarlem is a middle-class, successful city, beautiful city, and lots of industry. And people had the means to actually have art in their homes. So they were paying artists to do portraits like Frans Hals, still lifes, William Claesz and Pieter Claesz, and landscapes to decorate their homes and to document their lives. And they also did what are called genre paintings. And we'll talk about that when I show you a couple. So one more thing, sort of overall, Holland in the 17th century is the most, in the country, the region of Holland is probably the most economically successful country in all of Europe. They had great trading. They were on the North Sea. Antwerp had been a great trading center, but again, in the early part of the 17th century and later part of the 16th century, things start moving to Amsterdam and Haarlem. What else was Holland known for? Art, the development of art, the development of science. They had a strong military, and again, this very successful economic culture. So I'm going to move to our first painting, and I particularly love this portrait. It's by Frans Hals. As I mentioned, he was originally from Antwerp, and he comes into Haarlem, and he establishes himself with the Haarlem Guild of St. Luke's. And that was a very important guild for artists to join. Most of the artists we're talking about did. He was known for portraits. He was known for large group portraits. He was known for individual portraits. And of course, these marriage portraits and portraits of very successful militia and business owners in the city of Haarlem. And if you look at his brushstrokes, we can see a lot of influence from other artists, but let's talk specifically about this amazing marriage portrait. What is unique about it is that most marriage portraits in Haarlem, or in fact in Amsterdam too, were having the man on the left and the woman on the right, almost like a separated diptych. In this case, we have a portrait together, kind of unusual. There's a lot of unusual and beautiful qualities to this portrait I'd like to discuss. So here we have Isaac Massa and Beatrix van der Leen, two very wealthy Haarlem residents. Now, where's the money from? Well, he was not only a diplomat, but he was also a very successful merchant. And his wife came from pretty important wealth. So they were a very well-connected couple. And he also, Isaac Massa, traveled quite a bit throughout Europe. So he was a very traveled, educated, affluent member of Haarlem society. Look at their clothing. Remember, there are things called attributes in paintings that we know contribute to our understanding of the subject matter. So they're in these very beautiful, rich clothes, this kind of satin, very delicate lace. She wears a beautiful cap. She shows off her wedding ring, and she has her arm on her husband's shoulder. He holds his hand on his heart to show great love. So this is a very happy couple. Unusual for this time is the fact that they're smiling. And I love to use this little nugget of information that during this time and in the Renaissance, when a lot of portraits were done of the aristocracy, you rarely see them smiling. Why? Well, of course, bad dental care. Even if you were of an affluent class, you probably didn't have very beautiful teeth. Second of all, sometimes when you're holding a position in portraiture to have your portraits done, it's a little bit harder to smile, but mostly it was the teeth. But these people are smiling. They're happy. Okay, so let's talk about some of the iconography here. We have the statue of Juno, or Hera, the wife of Zeus, or Jupiter, depending on Greek or Roman. And she represents the idealization of marriage. We have this fountain here, and this fountain represents fertility, the flowing of water. We have beautiful landscape here on the right foreground. Rubens did not paint that landscape. He used that brush or the hand of another artist who was a landscape painter. We also have this thistle and tendrils of ivy. They represent, let's say, to be betrothed, to be to have fidelity. That's what these plants represent. And then we have in the foreground, in the very foreground, we have these beautiful birds. They look like peacocks. And that, of course, is this kind of like Garden of Eden quality, this beauty and luxury. And so this whole unique portrait, one of my absolute favorites by Frans Hals, incorporates what life was like for the upper classes, what might be attributes to their clothing, the iconography of sculpture and buildings. So, and then we have, of course, all this beautiful lush landscape. So this is a very successful marriage portrait of two important and very happy people. Now, in our very own Timken collection, we have this portrait of a man by Frans Hals. And this represents a single portrait. And in many ways, it kind of captures the essence of who Frans Hals was. As I mentioned, he was very successful. He was well-known. He was so important that actually, when Peter Paul Rubens from Antwerp came into Holland, into Haarlem, he visited the studio of Frans Hals. But their brushstrokes, their technique is quite different. Rubens was a little more methodical, but Frans Hals had this unique kind of gestural style. Look at the hand. Remember, I told you hands are the most difficult faces for many artists to paint. This is a beautiful hand, but it's very gestural. The clothing is a little more detailed. The doublet he is wearing in this cape here. But if you look at the facial features, again, a little bit more gestural. His brushstrokes were so impressive to artists, subsequent artists. Even if you look at the work of Manet, for example, in the 19th century France, he was very inspired by Frans Hals. So this man represents a middle to upper middle class merchant or burgher who is successful enough to have an important portrait painter capture his likeness. He looks successful. He doesn't have a big grin on his face, but he looks happy and content, a little ruddy complexion. We know that he was 48 years old because it's listed here, year is 48. And he does sort of represent Frans Hals in a way himself, because Frans Hals had a successful life. He was a happy person. He was lucky. Okay, we're going to go on to the next portrait painter. And this is by none other than Judith Leyster. And Judith Leyster's name really comes from the concept of Lodestar. And Lodestar was the name of her father's brewery, and it also represents kind of her position in society. She often actually had a little star as a part of her signature because she saw herself as kind of a leader in art, and she was. So she settles in Haarlem, although we know she lived sometime in Utrecht, where she was probably influenced by the Caravaggioists who had studied in Italy and went to Utrecht. But she basically has her career in Haarlem. And she was a prodigy. She was the first woman who entered the Haarlem branch of St. Luke's Guild, which most of these artists did. You kind of had to be well connected, but she was the youngest and the first woman. So that was an important idea. She captures many thoughtful images of children, for example. So this would be considered not so much a portrait, but more like a genre scene of everyday life. These artists wanted to capture what life was like in this middle class, thriving country of Holland, and in particular, this thriving city of specifically Haarlem, I should say. At this time, 1629, Haarlem is starting to lose its super control as an art center. And again, now we're starting to see Amsterdam take over. But suffice to say, many of these artists were hyper successful in Haarlem and chose to live in this beautiful city that had very close proximity to the larger city of Amsterdam. Let's look at these children. You can see a little bit of Frans Hals' brushstroke in these laughing children with Cat. As it's been said, she probably either studied with Frans Hals or they were colleagues. So certain art historical references that I researched said, oh, definitely she was a pupil. Others said not so much, more of a colleague. But suffice to say, her career was very strong and very recognized. Unfortunately, toward the end of her career, she moved to Amsterdam for a while, came back to Haarlem. She was married, happily married, but her husband, being an artist, often they shared the creation of one painting. It wasn't always decided who painted it. And in many ways, she kind of stopped painting and signing her own name. She did paint, but her husband did get a lot of the benefit of her artistic skill. So quickly, these funny, laughing children, again, with this very gestural brushstroke. And you can see the idea of Caravaggio here. Remember, Caravaggio was a known painter in Italy, and many of the Dutch were familiar with his work or even actually went to Italy to study his work. And of course, these artists who went to Utrecht to kind of work together and process some of the things they learned from Caravaggio do incorporate a lot of this light, and you can see it here. Now, the cat looks a little terrified. So these children are laughing and happily holding the cat, but in essence, the cat looks maybe not so happy, but the children definitely are. But look at the rich color she used. She was a very skilled painter. In fact, we're going to look in a moment at a portrait of her. So we'll move on. And we'll look at our very own Judith Leyster and Leyster. So that great play on words. She was a very bright, attractive, and successful woman. She confronts us by looking at the viewer in an unusual manner. We're looking directly at her. She confronts us. And then we see a painting of a musician. So we're going to talk a little bit about the meaning. Now, I do want to mention that around 1620, Haarlem did see a bit of the plague that came through. Remember, plague decimates Europe in the 14th century, in the 15th century, and it kind of comes back and forth. So around 1620, there was some plague in Haarlem. I'm bringing that up because many of these Dutch artists in their Vanitas still lives, which we'll talk about, mention metaphorically about the ephemeral nature of life and the ephemeral nature of certain aspects of life. And some of it can be attributed to them seeing and witnessing a city kind of under siege. It wasn't completely destroyed as parts of, for example, Siena in the 14th century in Italy, but there was some plague and people did witness some of the tragedy. Now, I bring that up because she paints a musician. Plague, musician, how does that relate? Well, what Judith Leyster was saying is that art endures. A painting will endure in a gallery, museum, in a home, private residence. But music is ephemeral. So a musician playing will dissipate into the air, like life is ephemeral. However, you might say that maybe that musician's work at that moment will be dissipated, but music in compositional form, of course, we know has lasted for centuries. She's kind of commenting on that. Shakespeare once did a very famous sonnet. It might be 13, I can't remember, but he talked about how beauty, again, is fleeting, but a sonnet, a beautiful poem, a play will remain for eternity. And kind of this sensibility in what Leyster is trying to point out. She's very skilled as an artist. She captures the nuances of her beauty and brains very successfully. I love the fact that she's looking directly at us, this 3/4 portrait. She holds no less than 18 brushes, and she paints in a very attractive costume. And you might say, do artists usually paint in fine linen and silk? No, probably not. But what is she saying? Most likely she's stating that art is an important endeavor, and I am showing my success and my importance. So, a portrait by Judith Leyster. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about a very fascinating phenomenon in Holland at this time. And it happened in Amsterdam and it happened in Haarlem. And it happened a little bit before this beautiful tulip watercolor was done. And what we have in Holland from 1634 to 1637 is what we call tulip mania. It's been kind of morphed into a different name, and I'm going to hold up the book. I hope that some of you might want to explore. It's called tulipomania. Tulipomania, I'm sorry, this is reversed. Tulipomania is the story of the world's most coveted flower and extraordinary passions surrounding it. So let's talk about tulipomania. Tulips come from the steppes of Asia and Russia. They came via the Ottoman traders and into the Ottoman Empire, maybe hundreds and hundreds of years ago, maybe as early as 1000 AD, Anno Domini. And they became very popular in the Ottoman Empire. If you go to Constantinople today, I've been fortunate to have visited Constantinople, the Sultan's palace filled with tulip fields. So the Ottoman Turks loved tulips, and traders brought from the Ottoman Empire, first from Ottoman Empire into Vienna, Vienna into Germany, into Holland, and the Dutch just loved them. Why? Well, they loved their beauty, their colors, but they also were captivated by the idea that tulips can grow very successfully in cold climates. First, they started with the hyacinth bulbs, but then the tulips took over. So what is tulipomania? It is the first futures market in the world, and in particular, Europe. This is a futures market, first one ever. Now, remember I mentioned earlier, Holland is such a successful economy. Their science discoveries, the discovery of the microscope, the trade companies, West India, East India Trading Company, they were trading all over the world. They even came to North America. They were going into Japan and China, North Africa. So scientific discoveries, they had such a strong navy. And their interest in science helps them develop observational skills. The microscope, the idea of light and atmosphere became very important. And they also loved botany. Now, in the city of Leiden, there was a very important botanist whose name escapes me, but in the latter part of the 16th century, this botanist was cultivating tulips in his garden and writing about them. And they became very popular about 40 years later, although Leiden did maintain its connection to the tulip world. So people began to speculate on tulip futures. It is said that one tulip bulb could be the same value as 10 times what a skilled artisan would make in 1 year. A canal house would be the equivalent of a few tulip bulbs. Just insane, really. Now, it did destroy some parts of the economy, but fortunately, there was some manner of getting out of some of these contracts for a fee. And so, although some people were ruined, not everyone was. So let's talk about this beautiful watercolor. She did do a book. It is in the magnificent Frans Hals Museum in Haarlem, which I have been blessed to visit. It has the work of Frans Hals and many other artists, of course, Judith Leyster. But we're looking at a tulip that has what's called a virus. These viruses created a more beautiful tulip. So if you go to Trader Joe's, for example, you will see that you have many solid colored tulips, red and yellow and pink and white. But what the Dutch really cultivated and loved were the variations, the striations created by this virus that split. It was a split, it was called the split virus, and it split the colors. So white and red, lavender and red, brown and lavender, just exquisite colors. And also some of them just had some tearing at the petals. We call that parrot tulips. So the tulip became such a hot commodity in Haarlem and Amsterdam. But by 1637, they sort of started to outlaw some of these speculations. This is a very delicate flower. And even today, if you go to the gardens in Amsterdam and Haarlem, you will see many, many seas of tulips. Now, we're going to go on to still life painting. And this is a magnificent painting by Pieter Claesz. And Pieter Claesz was member of the Haarlem Painters Guild. He also originally came from Antwerp in the latter part of the 16th century, early part of the 17th century, but he did most of his career was in Haarlem. Again, he too was a member of the Painters Guild, and he had a son who was a very successful painter. But let's talk about the general category of still life painting called vanitas. Now, it's really the Dutch and the Flemish in the 17th century where still life really takes off. Still life for still life's sake. Now, of course, throughout history, we see still life images in manuscript illumination before 1440, before the advent of the printing press, when books were handmade. We can see still lifes in Roman ruins, in Herculaneum and Pompeii. There were still lifes, particularly in Herculaneum. But really, this idea of a still life to document what is happening in Dutch homes, what their objects were like, what their feelings were like, really takes off in 17th century Haarlem and Belgium. So vanitas really categorically talks about the ephemeral nature of life. And again, I mentioned plague goes through Holland and goes through Europe. Life isn't always that easy, and many people did not live to a ripe old age. Now, that isn't to say that some artists didn't. Rembrandt lived well into his 60s. I believe it was Van Ruisdael, Jacob, who lived into his 80s. I mean, some artists did live long lives, but many times people feared the changing nature of life. And they included things called memento mori, a momentum of death. And probably the most clearly stark reminder of the impending nature of, of death is a skull. What better way to talk about death than show a skull? But there's other sort of subtle things. This lamp has burned out, waning of our existence. The inkwell is dry. And another thing Pieter Claesz is commenting on, this is a little more subtle, a little allegorical, is that knowledge, while it's powerful and important, even knowledge means very little when we think about the end of our life. As the end of our life approaches, do we really think about what we wrote or what we studied? I mean, many of us do, but some, in a very strict Dutch Reform artist, a patron or a Calvinist might think, none of this really matters as life wanes. So he is commenting, and he does this beautiful light-filled skull. You can see the nuances of light as it shadows the skull. And we have this overturned roamer. And a roamer, maybe roamer's a little bit bigger, but roamers were glass goblets, and they had little projections for the consumer to hold so it didn't shatter. But often you will see a roamer turned over to indicate temperance, because the Dutch were moderate people of moderate consumption. They did not believe, they were a little bit moralizing. They did not believe in overconsumption that you might have seen among the aristocracy, and let's say in the Rococo later on. This is earlier time, but you would see it maybe in the on the Spanish rule, Spanish Baroque perhaps, but they were really interested in more moderation. Now, our very own Timken still life, and this was done really still in the kind of the height of Haarlem as an important city, this beautiful smokers' requisites and breakfast scene. He was known for that. Now, unfortunately, and I know that our very important concept is the idea of light. And unfortunately, sometimes the painting doesn't quite show through as well as it did for the one previous, but that is only because it's very hard to sometimes get a good replica, as Blythe knows, because Blythe is so gracious to do all our PowerPoints for the museum. And I know sometimes she finds it difficult, but this one, unfortunately, is the only one really in this whole talk, I think, that you'll find a little, the colors are a little bit muted. So Pieter Claesz and Willem Claes Heda were the prominent still life painters. And remember, I told you, not only are they decorating people's homes, but they're documenting a lot about Dutch life. So he's a very skilled artist. When I take students throughout the museum, and we're going to be reopening in June, feel so happy about that. Many times when students look at this, young kids will say, oh, it's a photograph. No, it's not a photograph. Look at the date. Photography doesn't really exist for about 200 years, but it is so hyper real that many people think that some of these artists, even Vermeer, who's not talked about in this lecture because we're concentrating on Haarlem and he's from Delft, but they use optical devices, camera lucida and camera obscura. So camera obscura is more like a pigeonhole, and camera lucida is actually like creating almost like a room where light is streamed and you can see perspective. So he might have used that. Also, as I mentioned, the microscope has been invented by maybe a little bit later than this date, but von Leeuwenhoek from the same area of Vermeer. And we know that they were looking at optical devices. So maybe he used an optical device. That is not proven. We have fish cantilevered over a very plain table, and that indicates this is not an upper middle class. Remember, the Dutch society was very middle class or upper middle class, not so extravagantly aristocratic. This was someone's breakfast, and he cantilevers the plate the table because he wants to point out that, hey, I'm pretty skilled. I can even do this. So it's kind of advertising, but it's also showing allegorical reference to the ephemeral nature of life. Fish that are dying or dead, embers that are slowly being snuffed out here. And then we have this half full glass of beer. Now, the Dutch were great traders, as I mentioned, and Haarlem saw a lot of these goods coming in. Before 1650, we don't see as many elaborate goods like from China, Japan, North Africa. We see more things closer to home. But about 20 years later, you will see much more elaborate still life objects. Now, however, this is Venetian glass. They were trading with the Italians. We have a pewter mug or container, pitcher, I should say, with a beautiful reflection, the light as it falls on the knife. And the smoker's requisite, pipe and tobacco. And then, of course, this was the breakfast, beer and fish. And you might think beer and fish, well, water's kind of contaminated, and it was very low alcoholic content. So this would be a typical breakfast for a middle-class Dutch person. Now, I do want to go on to the work of Willem Claes Heda, who was from Haarlem, worked with our own Pieter Claesz, and was from Haarlem and was a member of the guild. And he was also a politician. So not only was he a very successful artist, he was involved with some of the political atmosphere of Haarlem, very known for that. And he was a pretty successful man. I love his still lifes. They're so exquisitely monochromatic. What you see is tonalities of gray. this gray brown, this very steely gray, this gray with dots of white. He loved to incorporate, almost always using this monochromatic tonality and gray. So we have still life with oysters, a rummer, a lemon, and a silver bowl. Now, you can definitely see many things in this painting. We have allegorical references to, remember I talked about moderation, broken glass. If you consume too much alcohol, you may have shattered glass. But we also have this beautiful, they call it a romer, and that is again those projections to hold a goblet with exquisite shadows here and light field. You can see reflections. And then we have this taza, which is a plate, sometimes fruit or nuts would be placed here, and it's overturned. Again, this allegorical reference to temperance. What does the lemon represent? Well, it shows this sort of exotic objects that were coming in from places like North Africa and Spain. And then we have the oysters. Now, remember, Haarlem is very close to Amsterdam. And one of the ways that Holland, the Netherlands, the northern Netherlands, was so successful as an economy was because they were connected to the sea. Not only did they have a strong navy, they were traders, and they also brought in the riches of the sea. So that's why we have oysters. However, there's a subliminal message too, and that is oysters represent fertility and sexuality. So there's a lot of hidden meanings. Again, look how he cantilevers the plate over the table, so skilled. Now, I'm going to show you another still life by this, this wonderful artist, still life of the lobster. Now, one of my favorite foods is lobster. Not that that means anything, but I mention it because some people might say, oh, lobster, a rich man's food. Today, of course, it is an expensive fish, but here it might have a little essence of that, but it's more or less, look how important the sea is to our economic strength. So we have a lobster and his little beady eye is staring at us. We have a lot of elements here. Again, we have this very decorative romer, and we have this, it looks like a gold spice, a container, and all kinds of different elements. Now, there is a unusual, looks like a stuffed bird. What does that mean? Well, in my research, looking at this painting, it probably represents, and I'm not 100% sure, but it probably represents resurrection. So it might have a relationship to the resurrection. And then we have some everyday things that are part of Dutch life. Now, remember I mentioned 1650. 1650 and onwards, the Dutch are very successful traders. They're bringing back all kinds of exotic goods, a lot of things from what would be today Asia, China, for example. So look at these plates. Now, they could be, this one looks like it could be Chinese, but this perhaps is Delftware, that blue and white ubiquitous Delftware that you see all throughout Holland today, and it was popular then too. So we have this plate of olives that most likely came from Spain. We have this beautiful, look how he handles the light on this little pitcher of water or perhaps wine. And then we have a little cone that might have held spices or the olives that tumble out of this plate. So we have a tilted plate. We have a knife holder right here, a beautiful knife. And then we have this exquisite fabric. And if you look back, I just want to show you, sorry. If you look back at the Pieter Claesz, you see a very, as I say, a much more very middle class, because there's no fancy tablecloth. It's very plain. But of course, with this particular painting, we see luxurious, probably silk. So that represents a much more upper class home to decorate and record the objects popular there. Now, let's look at landscape. Cornelius Vroom, who was the son of Heinrich Cornelius Vroom, was one of the most important predecessors to the whole landscape movement in Haarlem. One of his greatest students was Jacob van Ruisdael, and we're going to look at Van Ruisdael in just a minute. Cornelius Vroom, like his father, started out painting seascapes. But quickly he moved on to more landscape. And this landscape with imaginary Roman ruins is kind of a mixture of both. So this isn't the sea, of course, this is like an inlet. Remember, Holland and today Belgium are what we call the Low Countries. They have low, below sea level in some instances. They have a lot of canals and waterways and rivers. So water is a really important theme in the Netherlands, today's Netherlands. Now, this is a composite image. It's kind of, in a way, a little comical, because not in representation, it's beautiful, but comical in that we have an Italianate tomb among a Dutch landscape. So what is that? We don't think Cornelius Vroom did travel to Italy, but there was, again, this cross-pollination of Italian artists who maybe came to Holland, or many of them went into Italy to study. So they're very well of Italianate landscapes, and that's what this is. So as I say, he probably saw images, or he's talked to artists, saw artist work, and he incorporates a tomb. So whatas on the tomb? Bas relief. Okay, bas relief comes from the flat projection. It's not freestanding like a sculpture. Bas relief is projected from a solid form. And it's hard to distinguish this, but it looks like a horseman and a man enthroned. So that's kind of this projection here. What else do we have? We have some church steeples, and we have some boats with Dutch citizens here floating along this riverway. And we have something very, I think, kind of charming, and that is a woman, and she's shaking a tree so that the acorns fall down, because she's probably works on a farm where there are pigs. You see the little pigs here. So because of course I tend to run a little bit slower in the beginning, I'm going to go on a little bit. So we have waterway with a beautiful reflection. We see the town. He's commenting on the success of the town. And even though this is a composite image, you probably saw this landscape, this Dutch landscape, and gave it Italianate qualities. Now, this Spanish man of war engaging Barbary corsairs. This is a much earlier work, and it shows that he was still tied to what his father was doing. And these, now it could be attributed to his father. So if someone comes back and says, maybe that is Cornelius, Heinrich Cornelius Vroom, I could be mistaken, but I believe it's our Cornelius Vroom. Now, what's happening here? What are corsairs? Corsairs were pirates, and they were going up and down the Barbary coast, and they were pirates, and they would be known by, some of the men would sometimes wear turbans, but they would have a crescent moon on the ships. What is happening here? Well, there is a battle, and a battle takes place. They're locked in combat, and we have this smoke-filled middle ground, and then we have this Spanish battleship, and we have other ships coming like galleons to aid, and we have a Spanish flag in the distance. Now, here we have a red flag. The red flag means war. We're in battle right now. Another thing is these pirates were just a real problem because of all the Dutch trade that was going on. The pirates were thwarting and stealing. So this is a real problem. There is a sense of turmoil. There's great detail in this painting. So this boat looks like it was a corsair boat, not exactly sure, but we have slaves and rowers. So this whole huge cluster of rowers, and some were trying to desperately grasp their way out of the boat before they drown. And you can actually see this here in the middle ground. And then in the middle and foreground, you see boats kind of leaving the ship, and then we have other ships here. So a very active, sensational painting that documents some of the things that were happening with trade and ships in this part of the country. We'll move on because I'm running out of time. Samen van Ruisdael was the uncle of Jacob van Ruisdael, and he was too a very important landscape painter. And his son Jacob studied the works of Vroom, Cornelius Vroom, but he also was a pupil of Samen van Ruisdael. The Ruisdael family were actually Mennonites, and but I do believe Samen did become Christian. Not Christian, I'm sorry, more of a Dutch reform, but they were Mennonites, so it was kind of an unusual religion for that time, but they were a successful family. So he paints Deventer, which is not part of Haarlem, as a town outside, and it's really remarkable because what we have is the Groot Kerk, which means great church. We have it right here. Remember, many of these churches have been Catholic churches, and with the Protestant Reformation, they became Protestant. We have the whole city here. It kind of documents, we have the windmills, a little spit of land, and it shows something about not only that the Dutch were great on the waterways, but they also were very successful in their own endeavors with commerce and trade and investigation. And so he's proud of that. So this is something very common, this low horizon line and big billowy clouds, because remember, the Dutch love to study nature and the clouds and how sometimes life could be very ephemeral. I do want to move on. I will show the painting that we presented earlier, and this is in our very own Timken collection, Jacob van Ruisdael. Now, Jacob van Ruisdael, the nephew of Solomon, his father was also an artist, was very important, probably the most important landscape painter of the whole Netherlands, of Holland at this time, but particularly in Haarlem. And he was part of the guild. He was a successful artist. Some people document that he might have actually been a medical doctor. There are papers that talk about a medical doctor who had studied, who had left Haarlem, had gone to Amsterdam, and then into France. And so it is said that he might have actually been a surgeon as well as an artist. But we'll talk about primarily, just because we're really running out of time, and I'm just going to, hopefully it's okay, I'm going to go over a few minutes till about 11:50. This is in the Timken, as I mentioned. It's one of our most beautiful paintings, one of my favorites. And we have this very low horizon line, and we have the city of Haarlem and the bleaching fields. And you see the linen being bleached here, and the workers, tiny little figures, and St. Baubil's Cathedral. At one time had been a Catholic church, and that is where the artist was buried. We see the dunes, the beautiful dunes, and the details. Remember, they were scientifically motivated. They looked at botany and science. And again, this magnificent sky, the cumulus clouds, and how he comments on the ephemeral nature of life. Again, it's always subliminal, but he's saying, this clouds look like a storm might be brewing a little bit, and life can change. So the ephemeral nature of life, he documents what Haarlem was like literally in this time period. So this castle at Betham, this was a castle that existed across the way in Germany, across the Holland borders, Germany, and this was a castle. Now, he went with his friend, Nicholas Bertram. Nicholas Bertram, he actually named one of his children after Bertram. Nicholas Bertram was also an artist, and they were great friends. And they often went on these little travels together, and mostly around what would be today Haarlem and into Germany, which was close by. And they loved to do these painting trips. And he captures, Jacob van Ruisdael, this Bentham Castle. It's from the 11th century, and it's not on a hill. In reality, Betham Castle would be lower here. Betham Castle is so grand in the way he's placed it, up on a hill with these beautiful hills, plant and tree covered hills. We have, of course, the ubiquitous windmill. Remember, the Dutch had many industries. They were peat farmers, and that's how they also made their money, by harnessing energy, growing peat, and then giving and selling it to other countries like Germany. But this is a beautiful rendition of this Betham Castle. And lastly, I wanted to say that backing up just a tad with this, I do want to mention that Van Ruisdael was very prolific, and he did 15 of just this Haarlem scene, some of them very horizontal and some of them a bit more vertical. Two artists, I have just really a minute or two on each one. Adriaan van Ostad. Adriaan van Ostad was also a landscape painter and a genre painter. And this one is landscape with an old oak, but I just want you to see his beautiful, he was, I think, originally Flemish, if I'm not mistaken, but of course he was a member of the guild. He was a very successful man. He was involved with local politics. He married a Dutch woman who was Catholic, and he became Catholic. So that's just sort of interesting, as did Vermeer, for example. But this is a very beautiful oak tree. It's very diffuse light. It has this quality almost reminiscent of a talk I gave last week of the 19th century Hudson River painters. It's more romanticized. It's beautiful. So he might have been influenced by the work of Claude Lorrain, a little more diffuse. But I do want to show you that two more paintings and then we'll wrap it up. He also did what are called genre paintings. And genre paintings document life among more often the peasant class. And I hate to make this comment, but it is true that many of the Dutch, probably some more of the merchant class, they love to see these peasants carousing because it made them feel like, hey, I'm more sophisticated. I'm a little more civilized. I wouldn't drink like this or carouse like this. So they're making kind of a moral stand on this. But look how he uses this technique where one figure, either on the left or the right, leads the viewer to this entire scene. Now, we must say that he was influenced by the light of Caravaggio and the fact that the Dutch were so inspired by capturing light. This light just falls on their faces, these kind of crazy antics and this dark cavernous room. So light falls on this sort of what looks like almost like a table and here and the faces of these figures. But again, look at that gestural brushstroke. It's not as tight and meticulous as some of the artists. So I want to end with this last painting, and it's very tragic to me because Isaac van Ostade was the younger brother of Adrian, and there was a very large family. I believe there were 7 children. And Isaac, he was also a member of the Painters Guild. He joined at a very young age. He died at 28. And I'm not sure how he died. I tried to find it. I'm not sure if it was, illness, plague, accident. I really don't know. And if somebody does know, please let me know because it's haunting me And so he studied, he was very interested in some of these genre paintings like his brother, but he was a brilliant artist at capturing winter scenes. So this is remarkable. He of all the artists, he captured winter scenes. And so you really see this genre scene of lower, the more of the the peasant class. But there's fun too. There's these kids and they can't wait. They're getting ready to prepare their skates for ice skating on the solid ice here. But then we also have people working hard, like this man carrying a bundle of twigs across a beautifully captured bridge. And then you see this man with his horse trying to get with a load of, looks like a barrel, and then the peasants here. So there's a lot of beauty. If you think about Europe in the northern Europe in the winter, this beautifully captures the atmosphere and in the environment. And so I do want to end here because I've gone over a little bit, and we often have such great questions. And please, Blythe, if you could let us know, or else if you have some comments that your study of art history really helps in creating a dialogue. So take it away, Blythe. And I'm going to go to our last slide just so you know that we have some talks coming up.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Karen. That was such a great presentation. If anybody else wants to ask any questions right now, as Karen said, I'd love to open up the floor. You can unmute yourselves to kind of create a dialogue, or if you're more comfortable, you can also type something in the chat, and we can feel free to, we will relay those messages for you to everybody else, and I'll ask Karen for you. So feel free. And Karen, if you want, I want to just go to that landscape painting again of, the one we used for the title slide.
Oh, of course it is.
It's just so great. I just love the clouds. And I think we were talking about this before the presentation started. And, I think what it is really is the clouds and the blues and grays with the highlights of white, and then in the foreground you have this also pop of like a whiter color as well, and it all just the amount of detail too as you're looking over all the fields. It's so beautiful.
It really captures, when you selected this image for the title page, as we discussed, I was so happy because to me, it sort of is the essence of this whole talk. What was this city that was very kind of magical? And even today, it's a magical city. It's beautiful. And if you ever go to Amsterdam, take an hour drive, to Haarlem. It's so worth it. And you don't have so many bicycles, but you're so right. The sky, because they were studying the sky and light and weather changes, and, you know, it's cold, and they have to be aware because there's industry happening here with the linen fields. By the way, can the viewer see my arrow, using my arrow to point out, or not?
Let me see you move your
Okay,
arrow.
I'm painting, I'm right here on St. Bavo's.
No, you know, I think with the program that you're using, you can't. If you're
I
using
apologize.
Google Slides typically lets you, but not with this program, I don't think. But what were you gonna point out?
Oh, okay. Just having, like, as you say, it kind of captures the sky and the town, and, you know, here even where the artist was buried. So it really, this represents in such a nice way the 17th century and in Haarlem and Holland itself. But yes, I'm glad you pointed out, because I love looking at this. And when you visit the Timken, I hope viewers that you do, you can be in a room of Dutch and Flemish painting that has many of these works. And of course, they're from Amsterdam and Haarlem. Were there any questions or any other comments?
We have a thank you in the chat. So again, thank you so much, Karen. I don't have any questions in the chat box. Again, you know, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to chime in. And other than that, I do just want to say thank you to everybody so much for coming and listening to our tours. And I wanted to say that if you enjoyed this talk and you'd like to come to more, we have them on Thursdays at 11 a.m. every Thursday. And next week, we have another docent given talk entitled John Singleton Copley, Forger of American Identity. So that's going to be really fun. And I'll just check the chat box one last time for any questions, but I don't see any. So if nobody else has any other questions that they'd like to ask, I think we will, end it there.
Thank you so much, viewers, and thank you so much, Blythe. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.